Hello, my name is Audrey Rosenfeld, and I'm a licensed clinical social worker and a certified employee assistance professional. I'm also the president of Fully Effective Employees. We're your employee assistance program, and we have been providing EAP services to the employees of at work and your dependent family members for a number of years. Today, I'm going to be presenting a training on harassment, focusing primarily on sexual harassment and building a culture of workplace respect. Normally, I do this training in person, so there's an opportunity for a lot of interaction and discussing case scenarios. Since this is a recorded training, I would ask that you answer some of the questions at the end to test your knowledge, and we'll go over them together to see what information you were able to gain from this training. Our objectives today are to talk about what harassment is, the definition, what is sexual harassment, why does it happen, what occurs, and who are the victims, and who are the perpetrators. What are the costs of sexual harassment to both employees and businesses? We're going to identify the types of harassment, talk about who the victims are and how they handle it. We're going to talk about how you as employees can deal with sexual harassment, prevent it, educate yourselves, and report it if it occurs. I'm going to give you some case scenarios and some bystander scenarios, and then again, we'll go over the questionnaire at the end. Before I begin, I just wanted to do a quick overview about Fully Effective Employees. Most of you are probably pretty familiar with our program, but if you are new or you're not familiar with our program, just to give you a 5-minute overview. If you have any questions about our program or how to use it, there are materials that Gia has, both a brochure and a wallet card in the office, and she does have electronic information to send you, both payroll stuffers and newsletters. You can also call our office at 425-454-3003 and ask to speak with the on-call counselor. Our counselors are available 24/7. We work on a rotating on-call basis. So depending on when you call in, one of our counselors will be able to assist you. We have a very comprehensive website. You can log in to fee-eap.com. The user ID is a lowercase r 999, and the password is FEEEAP. There are 3 E's together, and it's all lowercase. Our program is confidential, and we're available to assist employees and your dependent family members with personal and work-related problems. Some examples of the kind of issues we deal with are things like stress, depression, anxiety, work, relationship, family, COVID issues, and the gamut of other emotional problems as well. What we do is we do an assessment. So we're going to talk with you about what is going on, how long the problem has been occurring, if you've sought help or treatment in the past, and if so, if it was successful. And we may just chat with you on the phone. That could be enough. Or we can provide up to 3 sessions. And currently we're using telemental health, which is like Zoom, but it has a confidential layer of HIPAA compliance. And we can do that at a time that's convenient for you. And if you require an ongoing referral for counseling or treatment, we're happy to match you up with your health insurance to do that. Right now, we know that it's very difficult to see counselors because COVID has created a really strong need for people to get emotional support and counseling. So we can act as a bridge until you're able to get into longer term counseling. And again, if you have any questions about our program, please feel free to contact us. Let's jump right into the topic and identify what harassment is. Harassment occurs when the actions of one or more people creates a situation where an individual worker or a group of workers might feel uncomfortable, belittled, offended, threatened, intimidated, and both men and women can be harassers and targets. Harassment might include offensive language, crude remarks, racial slurs, bullying, sexual comments, physical aggression, intimidation, discrimination, verbal abuse, or derogatory comments. So again, it's a wide range of behaviors and feelings that may occur as a result of harassment. Now, your at-work policy for harassment is a very extensive policy. I've copied it onto the slides, and I just want to go over some major points here. Now, the identification of harassment includes verbal, physical, and visual conduct that creates an intimidating, offensive, or hostile work environment, and that interferes with work performance. At work prohibits harassment by and towards employees, managers, and non-employees, such as people that you serve, your clients, customers, vendors, and outside contractors. At work does not tolerate comments or conduct relating to a person's age, color, race, religion, national origin, citizenship, or immigration status. Status as a victim of domestic violence, sexual assault, stalking, any sensory, mental, or physical disability, marital status, military status, sex, sexual orientation, genetic information, gender identity, political ideology, or any other status or characteristic protected by federal, state, or local laws. And this policy also extends to conduct of a sexual nature. So there's a very wide range here. Some of these are protected by federal and state laws, and some are not. But at work has a very wide encompassing policy. Harassment does not require the intent to offend. So if somebody makes an inappropriate joke, a prank, or even a compliment could be considered harassment. Even if it's not against the law, as I said, it won't be tolerated. An example would be if somebody makes a comment that degrades an employee's gender, that may not be unlawful, but it's an example of prohibited conduct under at-work's policy. And harassment can take many forms, and it includes, but is not limited to slurs, jokes, statements, gestures, pictures, and cartoons that can be perceived as offensive by other staff members, persons served, volunteers, or contractors. So the pervasive theme in all of this that I'm going to continue to talk about today is that it is not about whether the intent was to offend. It's how the recipient feels. If the recipient feels harassed, it is considered harassment. And sexual harassment is when submission to or rejection of such conduct by an individual is used on the basis for employment decisions affecting the individual, or if it has the purpose or effect of interfering with an individual's work performance or creating an unfriendly or offensive work environment. And we're going to talk about some of these examples. And reporting is a very important part of your policy. If you feel that you have been the object of harassment or discrimination, then you would report that to Human Resources. And if you are not able to report that to Human Resources because you feel that that is the cause of your problem or they are unwilling to resolve the problem, you can then contact the CEO or COO, and every reported incident will be investigated and taken seriously. And the information as a result of that report will be communicated to the employee. And corrective action may be taken up to and including termination of the offending employee if harassment is substantiated. So that's a really great policy. And now we're going to kind of break it down and talk about it in more detail. So what is sexual harassment? It's a form of discrimination. It's prohibited under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, which was formed all the way back in 1964. So back then, Title VII prohibited discrimination in employment based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. Now, the courts have also interpreted discrimination to be based on sex that would include or be identified as sexual harassment, which is conduct of a sexual nature in the workplace and unwelcome sexual advances or requests for sexual favors or verbal or physical conduct of a sexual nature that will all constitute sexual harassment. Harassers in the workplace can be a coworker, a victim supervisor, somebody who supervises an employee from a different department or area. It may be an outside vendor or even a delivery person. Could be an outside sales rep, a member of your company's board, or a high-ranking company officer, including the CEO. And sexual harassment can be conducted between all genders, male to female, female to male, male to male, female to female, supervisor to employee, employee to supervisor, and a non-company employee. So the old stereotype was that it was an older male supervisor was sexually harassing a younger female subordinate. And while that is still almost the most common type of harassment, it is not by any means the only. Why does sexual harassment occur? Well, sexual harassment, while it is about sex in terms of the sexual behavior, it isn't about sex in the sense that it's more about a power differential. It's often about somebody who wields power or inappropriate behavior on somebody else who may not feel they have the ability to do anything about it. So we often say that sexual harassment is about power. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, known as the EEOC, defines sexual harassment as unwelcome sexual advances, requests for sexual favors, and other verbal or physical conduct of a sexual nature that will constitute sexual harassment when submission to such conduct is made either explicitly, and that would mean being stated or being overt, or implicitly, where it's implied but not stated clearly that it could be a term or condition of an individual's employment. Submission to or rejection of such conduct by an individual as used as the basis for employment decisions which affect such individual. And such conduct unreasonably interferes with an individual's work performance or creates an intimidating, hostile, or offensive working environment. Sexual harassment is very expensive, both in financial costs and emotional costs. It is very expensive for a company because when employees are being sexually harassed, they often have very poor productivity. There is an extreme deterioration of employee morale, especially when it is occurring amongst many employees in a company. It creates excessive absenteeism because employees try to avoid coming to work and are often missing work or calling in sick. And of course, employees will often quit, which creates high turnover. And it's very expensive for an employer to have to recruit, rehire, and retrain new employees. It also creates damage to an organization's public image. And we certainly know from incidents we hear about in the media where a company will have been made public awareness of a company where multiple employees are alleging sexual harassment. And when a company is being sued or has to defend themselves, it's extremely expensive. So we have a real combination of things that will lead to a very expensive situation for employers. And to give you more elaboration on that and with some examples, until 1991, courts only awarded damages to those who were sexually harassed by offering them back pay and money back for lost wages, and gave them the opportunity to be reinstated to their previous position if they had been fired as a result of retaliation or disclosure. But now the plaintiff can pursue damages, which can include future financial losses, emotional pain and suffering, and punitive damages. And the ranges can be anywhere from 75,000 to as high as over 170 million. And that was in 2012, one sexual harassment case alone had an award of 168 million. So 10 years later, we know that's even higher. And if a claim is settled out of court, on average, it can be anywhere between 75 and 125,000. And if it goes to court, it will at least double. And that's just for one case. So when companies hear about multiple victims coming forward, it can be extremely expensive. The average Fortune 500 company loses $6.7 million a year due to sexual harassment. And let's talk about what goes into that $6.7 million number. It's not just the fines and the legal fees and the court fees and back pay, but it's also the whole way a company is involved. So that if employees are calling out sick, and avoiding interacting with the perpetrator, and people are being given sick time, but they're not doing their jobs. Or there's high turnover, as I mentioned, having to recruit and rehire and train people, and not only the harasser, but the victim. And the low productivity is going to affect a company's bottom line, because employees' morale will decrease and victims might have difficulty concentrating or just not up there doing their job. They just don't care, or they can't. Also important to note that sexual harassment is not limited just to the workplace. It can also occur during business-related travel, business dinners, conventions and conferences, office parties, office sporting events, and even in the company parking lot. If employees go out to dinner and somebody gets drunk and makes inappropriate comments, even if it's after hours and they're paying for their own drinks, that could still be considered sexual harassment. And certainly we know that company events where there's alcohol involved often can create some pretty significant problems. The Me Too movement was started about 4 or 5 years ago, when really sexual harassment started coming to the forefront, and we were hearing about these multiple cases where many employees were coming forward disclosing sexual harassment at work. And Alyssa Milano, the actress who had been sexually abused, stated that if all the women who have been sexually harassed or assaulted wrote Me Too as a status, we might give people a sense of the magnitude of the problem. So for those of you who remember, people were doing the hashtag with Me Too on social media, and it was absolutely amazing how many people were coming forward. And it really wasn't just women, because there's been plenty of other, genders that have been impacted by sexual harassment. And sexual harassment, the Me Too movement dealt specifically with sexual violence. It could be rape, incest, sexual assault, and sexual harassment. And the idea was to make sure that survivors had access to resources for support, counseling, and help, dealing on healing and survivorship, and really trying to create so much awareness that it would disrupt the system that allows sexual violence to continue to flourish in our society. And out of the Me Too movement came this Time's Up idea, which was really focusing on sexual harassment in the workplace and creating change leading to safety and equity in the workplace, eradicating sexual harassment by solving inequality of power balances and getting legislation passed for gender parity, and creating a legal defense fund to fight sexual misconduct through the justice system. There are two types of sexual harassment. The first is quid pro quo, a legal term that means something for something. And it occurs when an employee is subjected to unwelcome sexual advances or requests for sexual favors by the supervisor as a condition for hiring, promotion, or continued employment. So an example of that would be, if you go on a date with me, I might put you in line for a promotion. Or if you won't have sex with me, I don't know, but we're going to have to lay some people off and you might be next. So there's a really clear, if you don't do something, there will be a negative consequence. And if you do something, there will be a positive one related to your employment. And the other is a hostile work environment. And that is when conduct is sufficiently severe and pervasive to alter the conditions of a person's employment and that creates an abusive working environment. This can include offensive language, jokes, innuendos, comments, graffiti, and touching. An example would be a worker that frequently asks a coworker about his or her sex life would be considered a sexual hostile work environment. And again, as I've mentioned many times already, it's really about how the individual feels. Even if the person or the perpetrator just thinks they're making a joke or they're being funny, if the recipient doesn't feel that it's funny or a joke and it's pervasive, it will be considered a hostile work environment. The question then comes up is, if it's an isolated incident, does that create a hostile work environment? And the answer is no. An isolated incident would not be. Let's say a person makes one comment. Ideally, the victim would say, that's inappropriate. I don't like that comment. Don't do it anymore. But It's really whether it's a severe, persistent, and pervasive pattern of behavior that would constitute a hostile work environment. So somebody your coworker always walks by you, and every time they do, they make a comment of, sexual nature, or, making rude gestures. That would be considered severe and persistent. It's also whether the person's conduct interferes with their ability to do the job. If somebody is trying to do their job and somebody is constantly making sexual comments or jokes, it may interfere with that person's ability to do their job. And again, it's how the impact of the conduct is perceived by the person receiving it or by a bystander. And we want to measure this by a reasonable person standard. It's another legal term that says that the law doesn't mean that anybody can claim they've been offended and get legal support for virtually anything that bothers them. So you can't say, I don't like the way so-and-so looked at me, that was sexual harassment. Would a reasonable person state that? You have to prove that not only was that person offended, which is a subjective standard, but that a reasonable person in the same situation would also have been offended. And that's considered an objective standard. The laws are not designed to protect every employee from every behavior or comment that might offend them. So that's really important to note. And there are 4 types of behaviors that contribute to a hostile work environment: verbal, nonverbal, physical, and written or digital. Let's talk about verbal harassment. So what's not okay? It's not okay to tell off-color jokes of a sexual nature. It's not okay to discuss your sexual activities or that of other people, or making sexual comments and innuendos about a person's body or physical appearance, probing into a person's sexual experience or preferences, using demeaning or inappropriate terms such as stud, baby, sweetie, or referring to someone as hot or sexy, turning work discussions to sexual topics, making suggestive sounds or whistling at a person, repeating obscene or suggestive comments. Those are all things that are verbally done, which are not okay. Nonverbal harassment, what's not okay? Displaying sexually suggestive visuals, calendars with sexy poses or women scantily clad, cartoons, pictures, magazines, posters, anything that has suggestive sexual material or content, leering or ogling suggestively at a person, making suggestive sexual gestures with hands or through body movements, giving unwanted personal gifts, making facial expressions such as winking or throwing kisses. Physical harassment, what's not okay? Invading someone's personal space, blocking their way, making it unavailable for them to get by without having to touch you, giving a neck or shoulder massage, unwanted deliberate touching, leaning over, cornering, touching or rubbing oneself sexually around another person. And internet and email harassment includes things like text messages, instant messenger, email, web surfing, or social media. So you can't be, sending messages to somebody after hours at work of a sexual nature, even if it's after work, that still constitutes sexual harassment. Let's give some examples. What would be okay and what's not okay? Your coworker is wearing a new sweater and you tell them how nice it fits their body. That would not be okay. What you could do is say, I really like your new sweater, or your sweater looks really nice, but you don't want to mention how it affects their body. Your coworker tells you they're stressed, so you rub their neck and shoulders. Well, we talked in the previous slide about how that's not appropriate. And this is a really tough one because the last time I did a training with a group of people, I walked in and people had already started to get seated, and 2 employees were involved in a neck and shoulder rub. And I had to talk about how that would not be appropriate, and we needed to stop that right then and there in the training. And the reason that it's not appropriate is that there may be 2 coworkers that are very comfortable with each other and feel like that's okay. But we don't know whether that behavior makes another coworker uncomfortable. And we also don't know that the person that is getting the neck or shoulder massage really wants it. Maybe they don't feel comfortable saying that they don't want it, and maybe they really don't. And often those things can lead to other sexual gestures and behaviors that can be perceived as sexual harassment. So it's very important to stay away from that kind of bodily contact. You and your coworker are dating. Well, that may be fine. It depends on what your company's dating policy is. Most employers require that if employees are dating, that they sign a mutual consent to date agreement, and they both sign it, date it, and present it to HR. You ask your coworker about their sexual fantasies. Definitely no. You meet a new employee and shake their hand. Well, a year and a half ago when I did this training, it was obviously more relevant. Now I don't think many of us shake hands because of COVID. But in the past, yes, that would be appropriate. And you may fist bump now, or not, or bow. But when you're having any kind of physical contact with an employee, sometimes some cultures or religions do not permit handshaking or touching of the opposite sex. So I think now, for all intents and purposes, it's probably better either to do a fist bump, bow, or just say hello. And we have the excuse of COVID to make that clearer for us. You ask a coworker for a date. Again, that should be fine. Lots of people meet at work. We just want to be careful in terms of whether it is a wanted ask. And if you keep asking and somebody says no, that would be considered harassment. You give a coworker a birthday gift. Yes, that's appropriate, assuming that you have a relationship or a friendship and that the gift is not of a sexual nature. Where it is not appropriate is if you're showering somebody with lavish, inappropriate gifts, or if it is an unwanted gift because you are harassing somebody or pressuring them to have a different kind of relationship with you. You hug a colleague who's tearful because they're going through a divorce. Again, because of COVID, we're not likely to do that. It is often appropriate to provide physical comfort when somebody is tearful or very visibly emotionally upset, but it's always a good rule of thumb to ask them first. Is it okay if I give you a hug? Would you like a hug? And again, we have that other layer with COVID, so we really do want to ask that now for sure. You have dinner with a colleague at a business convention. Yes, that's perfectly appropriate, assuming the colleague does not feel coerced into going or has been asked and has declined, and then you continue to force it. So if you're friends, you want to go to a business convention, that's perfect. Dinner at a business convention, that's perfectly fine. And you tell a colleague who has lost weight that their butt looks good. Absolutely not. You can tell a colleague, I noticed you lost weight, or you look really good, you lost weight, how did you do that? But be very careful about how not drawing attention to any parts of their body. And again, we've talked before about joking. So if you say things like, I didn't mean it, or I was joking, that is never considered an excuse or a defense. Under the law, actual intent is irrelevant. What is relevant is the impact of the behavior on the recipient. Why victims don't speak out? Well, fear is really the biggest issue. They fear losing their job, that people won't believe them, that especially if they're not believed, that there'll be retaliation, that they could be punished, demoralized, bullied, or lose their job. They're afraid that they'll be rejected and not taken seriously, or be accused of not having a sense of humor, or maybe they developed a friendship and got close with this person and it turned into a bad way, and they're worried that they're going to be told they asked for it or they contributed to it. And there's always the fear of being labeled a troublemaker, being labeled overly sensitive, or even worse, that the person would be labeled mentally unstable. A lot of times, the biggest issue is the fear of not being believed, losing their job, or being retaliated against. And oftentimes, the victims wait until somebody else comes forward, and then they feel like they have the ability to come forward themselves, which is why we often hear about multiple situations in one company. Often victims will ask, why me? And it's very normal to question why you have been singled out. It's often a very emotional process for the victim, thinking that maybe they contributed to it, maybe this keeps happening to them, and wondering what they could have done to have made them become a victim. It's also very normal to feel powerless because you can't make it stop, or to feel pressured due to fear. It's normal to be conflicted about making a complaint. Oftentimes, a victim might really like the perpetrator or feel guilty and worry that if they come forward, they want it to stop, but they really don't want the person to be fired. Maybe they know that that person is a single parent or struggling financially, and they worry that if they come forward, that person will get terminated and it will be their fault, even though they want it to stop. There's this tremendous fear of retaliation, feeling like they've brought it on themselves, or maybe even that they've been imagining things and that this really isn't as bad and that they should just tolerate it. What should you do if you're being harassed? We went over the policy in detail, and the at-work policy is very clear that behaviors are not tolerated, and they're very clear about the process for investigation. As a result, you should know your rights. You can always consult with an attorney if you aren't sure if you have a case of sexual harassment. It's ideal that you tell the harasser to stop. Clearly stating that their conduct is unwelcome and inappropriate might stop it when it first occurs so that it doesn't escalate to the point where you feel you have to report. Although we do really encourage you to report all instances. You also want to document any events that were related to the harassment, including the time, place, date, who said what, where you were, if there were any witnesses, and if it impacted your work performance. You may feel that there's one incident and it may hopefully be an isolated incident, but if it happens again, you may not be able to remember what happened the first time. So the more that you document and are clear about the situation, the easier it's going to be to recall during a time when you need to report it or you're emotionally stressed. You want to save any memos, letters, emails, or text messages, or any kind of evidence related to the harassment. And then if, for example, you had a negative performance review, you were demoted, or there was a position title change that could indicate a hostile environment, or any threats that could be considered quid pro quo, you want to make sure that you document that. You want to put your complaint in writing and report the behavior to HR, and give them the opportunity to do an investigation and to correct the situation. And if there's ever been retaliation, you want to make sure that you report it. Again, we've repeated this over and over, but under the law, you are protected from retaliation. There are a number of high-profile sexual harassment cases that have occurred. Most of these have occurred that I have documented occurred in 2017, and that was partly because that was when the Me Too movement was pretty prevalent. In September 2020, Google had a parent company, Alphabet Inc., that pledged $310 million to expand diversity efforts and resolve shareholder litigation that alleged the company's board failed to prevent sexual harassment and hid the misconduct by executives. A $310 million fine is huge. Chipotle settled a lawsuit in which a male employee alleged that he was harassed by his female boss and was locked in a freezer after he reported the harassing behavior. So this is a great reminder that not all sexual harassment perpetrators are men, and that often it's about power more than gender, and that there was also a situation of not only harassment, but retaliation. Netflix terminates its production relationship with Kevin Spacey as a result of multiple on and off the set sexual harassment allegations. So again, an at work and an off work situation. An example of that. NBC News terminates its contract with Mark Halperin after 5 women came forward alleging they harassed them. And Amazon Studio Program Chief Roy Price resigns after allegations of sexual harassment from multiple women on multiple occasions. And 21st Century Fox pays out $50 million in costs and fees to settle harassment claims against Fox News. Again, a lot of these are about media because these are really big companies where major executives are being charged with sexual harassment or having allegations against them, and when multiple victims are coming forward. But then we can also see that a smaller single restaurant can have the same situation occur. So how do you deal with sexual harassment? I mentioned earlier that ideally, it's really important to tell the person or offenders to stop. So some of the things that you could say if you were able would be, and use your own words, but you and I work together and I value that relationship, but there's something that I need to tell you. When you tell me, and you can use your example, whether it's dirty jokes, calling names, touching me, staring at me, whatever that is, I am uncomfortable and I feel, and then you would express how you feel. And for me, this behavior is unwelcome and it's sexual harassment and I want it to stop. And if you don't stop the behavior, I will go to HR and file a complaint. What you're doing is you're identifying what the behavior is, how it makes you feel, telling them to stop, and that if they do not stop, you will move forward with a complaint. This is a really good thing to do in a single isolated incident, or when there's two incidents, so that you may be able to prevent it from ever going further. But some people don't feel comfortable addressing the perpetrator or asking them to stop. And that's where you would document and then report it. Bystanders are groups of employees or individual employees who are witnessing a behavior that is of a sexual harassment nature, or perhaps a bullying nature. A passive bystander is basically a witness, and an active bystander is somebody who takes action to prevent or reduce the harm. And it's really good that all employees work together as a collective team where they look out for each other and they hold their peers accountable for behavior changes. So if you observe a prohibited behavior and you are a witness, here are some suggestions of things that you can do. You can ask the victim if they feel harassed. Remember, it's how the victim perceives the behavior. So if they're like, oh, that doesn't bug me, we joke around all the time, I'm not offended by it. That might be one situation. But if you know that the person, and if you know the person who exhibited the behavior, you could advise them that you observe this behavior and that it's inappropriate. You could assist the victim in reporting the situation. If they don't want to report it, you should report what you saw to your supervisor, because oftentimes if it's occurring to one person, it may well be occurring to others. And if you feel it's really minor and you're not willing or ready to report it, document the situation in case there's a future investigation. Other ways that you can help is if you're a witness to it, you can try to change the subject to take the tension and the escalation out of it. You can call out the harassment when you see it. You could say, hey, John, what you just did is considered sexual harassment and you need to stop. Or you could try to take John aside and let him know that what he did was really inappropriate. You want to be very careful not to escalate a situation by publicly chastising, embarrassing, or being too overly corrective to somebody in a public situation. So it's always good to speak privately and discreetly also with the victim. And again, indicating your willingness to confirm their accounts if they choose to report the harassment. And then making a decision whether you yourself are going to go ahead and report it, depending on the pervasiveness and severity of the situation. We're going to talk about a couple of case scenarios. This is a bystander case scenario. One night you're working late. Supervisor Tom and a new colleague Jane are also working late. Jane is in Tom's office and the door is open, and you clearly hear Tom propositioning Jane several times. Each time Jane says no. Tom then tells Jane that as a new employee, he can make things difficult for her. And since she's a new employee, there's nothing she can do. The next day you speak privately with Jane. You ask her if she's okay and if it's happened before, and she says it's been happening since she started the job. You tell Jane you will be a witness and she should report the behavior. Jane says she's afraid to make a claim as she needs her job and can't afford to get fired. This is the situation of sexual harassment. There's quid pro quo because you hear that Tom is telling Jane, number one, there's nothing she can do, position of power, she's a new employee, and that he's going to make things difficult for her if she doesn't do what he wants from her. And Jane clearly says that she perceives this as harassment and she's afraid of retaliation. So what should you do? you want to let Jane know that under their law, there can be no retaliation, and that whether or not she makes a claim, you have to report it, because this is a very clear example of sexual harassment. And if you don't report this, you will be enabling the behavior. It's really important to use the motto, if you see or hear something, you should say something. The courageous act of speaking up can change your employment culture. So if you're a silent bystander, you're not doing anything to change something, which could be a very problematic situation in your workplace. You want to stand up for your colleagues, be an ally when your colleague feels unable or unwilling to report prohibited behavior, or be a witness when they do. Very, very important that we all have a culture that if we hear or see something, that we say something. We're going to now go into some other case scenarios, and these are sexual harassment rather than bystander scenarios. I want you to be thinking about how you think, how you feel, and what you might do if these scenarios occurred. As I mentioned at the beginning, normally I would ask for some group interaction. Because this is a training video that's recorded, I would really like you all just to think about how you might handle these situations. The first scenario. In preparation for gender reassignment, Cameron has recently changed his legal name to Karen and has started to dress in more feminine clothing. Many of Karen's coworkers have been supportive, but some have not. She expected that things might be a bit awkward, but was taken aback when last week she discovered that 2 coworkers, Sharon and Rob, had been taking pictures of her and posting them on social media, along with negative comments and their ideas about how they can teach Karen a lesson and teach her how to be a woman. Now her coworkers are starting to avoid her. So this is definitely sexual harassment. They are not only are they a couple of people harassing her, but they're making it bigger by posting it on social media and getting other coworkers in on the situation. So what would you do? How would you handle a situation like this? This would definitely be something that you would report to HR. And this is that, if you see something, say something. In scenario 2, over the past few weeks, Kendra has been working with her manager, Yosef, to learn how to code technical data. Whenever they are alone, Yosef stands a little too close to Kendra and has started touching her hand and shoulders while they talk. When he asked her to have dinner with him last week, she told him she's not interested. Today, Yosef asked Kendra to come to his office and again asks her out. When she starts to refuse, he quickly interrupts and suggests that if she stops playing hard to get, he could approve her to move to the next level more quickly. We have a power differential here. We have a manager with an employee. We have physical touch and harassment. We have quid pro quo, asking for dinner, even though she told him she's not interested. He told her that if she stops playing hard to get, he could approve her to be advanced. So this is a clear, overt stated situation of quid pro quo and clearly sexual harassment. Case scenario number 3. The company's holiday party is at a local restaurant. There's an open bar. Wendy, an employee from another department, has had too much to drink. She's slurring her words, talking loudly, and dancing provocatively. The next week, Jim, one of your employees or colleagues, if you're a supervisor, would meet with you. And Jim alleges that at the party, Wendy cornered him, rubbed up against him, and propositioned him. When he said no, she waited for him in the parking lot and propositioned him again. Since then, she's been sending him texts with sexual pictures of herself and sexually inappropriate emails. Again, you've got lots of examples here. This was an out of work environment, so it didn't happen at the workplace, but it involved 2 employees. Alcohol was involved, which is always a bad thing in terms of inhibitions and inappropriate behavior. But it wasn't just an excuse that it was outside of work and she was drunk, but the next time she cornered him again in the parking lot and propositions him once again. And she had nonverbal harassment by sending him text messages with inappropriate pictures and emails. So this is a very significant sexual harassment situation. And clearly, if this is something that you witness or you're told, and Wendy's not willing to come forward, it would be important for you to do that. Case scenario 4, Karishma, Angie, and Chris work in the same office area. Karishma and Angie are good friends, and they regularly go out together on the weekends. At work, they often talk and laugh together about the men they go out with, sometimes loudly sharing intimate details. In her work area, Angie has a picture of the backsides of a line of male dancers. Chris works near Karishma and Angie and can't avoid overhearing their conversations. This week, he hears Angie making sexual comments while showing Karishma some pictures on her phone. Well, initially, this might not be a problem for Chris, but it's now become pervasive and is impacting his ability to do his work because he's working near them and he's overhearing their conversations. So we've got pictures which are inappropriate at work. We've got conversation of a sexual nature that's inappropriate. And even though they're not directing it to Chris, they're impacting him and he is finding it offensive. Case scenario number 5. Gary's an employee who is close to retirement. He tells his supervisor that he's offended by all of the off-color sexual jokes that are told in the break room. He's also offended by all the talk describing sexual relationships and conquests. He has let the other employees know that he is offended by this. The other employees responded by telling him he doesn't have a sense of humor, he's from another generation, and this is the way the world is now. Gary is only 6 months away from retiring. Should this still be investigated or just wait because he's retiring soon? This should absolutely be investigated because it is pervasive. And if it's offending Gary, it may well be offending other people. And it's also setting a very negative tone for a workplace culture that is permitting extensive discussion about sexual conquests and relationships and sexual jokes, which are considered sexual harassment and a violation of your work policy. A respectful workplace is really important. The issue of sexual harassment isn't about blaming people, judging them, or pointing fingers at them. It's about recognizing, about awareness and education, and about acknowledging that no matter what our gender, culture, family background, thoughts, beliefs, and attitudes, we must all be a catalyst for change, to support each other and to prevent this from continuing to occur. One training can't reverse centuries-old gender stereotypes, change attitudes, which have been able to justify, trivialize, minimize, and shift blame for sexual harassment onto the victims. It doesn't erase our upbringing and peer influences or stop the objectification primarily of women on TV, media, songs, lyrics, movies, and magazines, or compel a system that creates a culture of zero tolerance. But I want to emphasize, we're getting there. We have the Me Too movement. We have a lot of information now about what's going on in other companies, the fines that are occurring. Media is beginning to really state that this isn't okay. And even the most recent example of Chris Cuomo, where, there were, Governor Cuomo, where there were very significant incidents of sexual harassment. We are now becoming so much more aware, and each and every one of us at work can do something about this. So training and awareness and education is just a part. Now I wanted to go over our true and false questions just to see how you're doing, if you can answer these questions, and let me know what you think about your answers. And hopefully you'll have all of them right after what we've discussed today. True or false? To qualify as sexual harassment, the parties have to be of the opposite sex. We know that's not true. Managers and supervisors can never be personally sued for sexual harassment. This is also false. Supervisors and managers who are aware of sexual harassment and don't take action to investigate or report it to Human Resources for an investigation could be considered liable if they know something is going on and they have done nothing about it. Number 3, an employer will not be liable for sexual harassment committed by managers or supervisors as long as the employer is not aware of the conduct. And again, I just answered that. That is false. Employers will be liable or could be liable. Number 4, to bring a lawsuit for sexual harassment, a victim does not need to show that he or she suffered a monetary or economic harm, such as being fired or demoted. That is also false. It doesn't have to be monetary or economic harm. There can be emotional harm or trauma or the inability for one to do their job. Number 5, if a victim of sexual harassment asks a manager or supervisor not to tell anyone about the sexual harassment, the supervisor should not take further action. Is that true or false? That is false. If an employee does not immediately complain about offensive behavior, the behavior is probably welcome and not harassing. Again, that is false. As we know, many employees have a hard time coming forward. Number 7, the company can be held liable for incidents of sexual harassment that occur at an official company function during business hours or non-business hours. And again, we mentioned that it can be non-business hours or outside of work, and it can still be considered liable. An employer is not responsible if a person who provides a service harasses its employees because the provider of services is not employed by the company. And if you remember at the beginning, I said that it could be a vendor, could be a client, or somebody that you provide service to. We want to make sure that the policy also includes those people. Number 9, if your intentions are good, your behavior isn't harassment. That again is false. Remember, it's not what your intentions are, it's how the victim perceives it. Number 10, unwanted work emails that are sent with comments of a sexual nature aren't considered sexual harassment because it is written. And again, that is false, because if you remember, nonverbal or written harassment is considered harassment. Number 11, sexual jokes or humor may be considered sexual harassment if they have the effect of creating a hostile work environment. That is true. And number 12, quid pro quo harassment is when a supervisor's demand from a subordinate is in exchange for continued employment, and that is true. That is the end of our presentation today. Again, if you have any questions about the Employee Assistance Program, or you want to run a scenario by us where you feel you may be harassed, you are free to do that confidentially. We encourage you, if you have any other questions about your sexual harassment policy or any concerns about yourself or someone you work with, please let Gia know. And once again, if you're not comfortable reporting it to HR, you know in your policy that you can report it to others within your company. Thank you so much for your time, and I hope all of you take good care of yourselves.